Hello, listeners. Here we are giving you another episode of 11 Hours Apart, a chilling podcast. As always, she's Leah and I'm Chi. And today we'll be talking about this movie that came out a while ago, The Last Duel. It's directed by Ridley Scott and with Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Adam Driver, Jodie Comer in it. I think it's a great movie, but maybe Leah, would you like to share your thoughts first before I jump in?
Hang on, Chi. My speakers are playing a song. I'm so
What?
sorry.
That's okay. No,
Okay.
I'm not hearing anything. Like just so you know, I didn't hear the song that was playing on your end. I didn't hear it, so I didn't think it was recorded. The song that is.
No, it wasn't.
It's okay.
Hello, one and all. I am sorry for my distraction.
You're fired.
My I had these headphones are Bluetooth and they were also connected to my phone, and I got a phone call, so they like diverted to my phone for a minute, and then when I turned off the Bluetooth on my phone, they went back to the computer, and then it played this StreamYard played this song of testing the speakers. So I did not prompt that to happen. It just automatically
Some
happened. So
accident.
anyways,
But listeners, you're not gonna see Leah next time. She's fired on the spot.
That's why if I looked very confused and distracted while Chi was talking, that is why. Okay, but I'm here now. I can hear everybody, and hopefully you can hear me. Okay. Yes. Did you say, Chi, what we are going to be discussing this week?
Yeah. So I did all that, and then the
Cool.
last thing I said was, would you like to share your thoughts first before I jump in?
Oh,
So would you like to do that?
Okay. Thanks for asking.
We're
The
so
last
professional. No, it's okay.
the
Please, just don't. Yeah, it's
the
funny.
Last Duel. And I do want to point out, like you said before we started streaming, that you had watched 2 more episodes of the House of Dragon,
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
House of the Dragon. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd like to maybe touch on that at some point too. And if it comes in like while we're talking about The Last Duel, like feel free to bring it up. Chi is basically what I'm saying. Like I'd love to hear what you thought of the next 2 episodes that you saw. But The Last Duel, that is our primary focus of this conversation. I just watched it yesterday for the first time, and I thought it was really good. It was quite long. It was a very long movie. I was shocked. I kind of had to interrupt I didn't watch it all in one sitting because I had stuff going on. So I had to like pause it at a certain point, and like there was actually a couple times when I paused it because I had to get up to get like a drink or something like that. And every time I paused it, I was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much more of this movie left. So it was like a really long movie. And in some ways, like I it was long, and I definitely noticed how long it was. And it was a movie that I did not hesitate to pause when I needed to pause it, but maybe that's because it is like broken up into different chapters. It almost watches like individual episodes of a show or something. I don't know, not really, because they all like mesh together. But it at the same time, I don't know if I'd exactly say that it was like too long or that it shouldn't have been that long. Like I kind of in the end appreciated that it was that long. And there are movies that obviously you watch and you're like, that movie was longer than it needed to be. This movie, it was long, but I don't know if they could have like cut too much out from it either. So it's almost like it was as long as it needed to be. And so I thought it was really good, though. It seemed like really high quality. I loved how authentic things looked, like it being a period piece and set in like medieval times. Like I loved all the costumes and the castles and the settings and the horses. Like they clearly used real horses for a lot of the scenes. And I always appreciate that. I know like horses in movies is like a major expense and also takes up a lot of time when they're filming. So I always like thoroughly appreciate it when they use real horses, because to me, they CGI horses just do not go they do not at all like look as good to me as the real deal. So I love seeing real horses, especially in medieval movies. So that's one thing. I know I didn't mean to like dwell on that for so long, but it's something that I definitely noticed. I loved, like, as I said, like the costumes were, I thought, like, really good. The writing was really good, and this is the first movie that Ben Affleck and Matt Damon wrote together since Good Will Hunting, and that is crazy because the 2 movies could not be more different. Like, they are very different stories, and yet again, I feel like Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, like, just show that they know how to write a good story together. I don't know what it is about the 2 of them, but they just do. Um, there's a lot of interesting things I think we can get into, Chi, about, like, the fact that this movie kind of didn't make very much money, even though it definitely is a high quality movie in my mind. Like it the production value is really high, the story's really good, the writing's really good, the acting was really good. It was intriguing. The payoff at the end was really good. All of it. Like it was a well-crafted movie, well directed, like the cinematography was great. I was so impressed with the writing, especially when it came to I did not know. I forgot. I think I maybe knew this once upon a time, but it's been a while since this movie first came out, and like I saw like the original like trailers and stuff like that, or heard like murmurings about it. I had forgotten until I sat down yesterday to watch it, that this movie is told from the 3 different perspectives of the 3 main characters. And so when I realized that that was going to be happening, that it's one of these movies where it goes back and tells the same story again from another perspective, like every time a movie or show or whatever does that, it always there's a bit of a danger of it getting boring because they're going back and showing the same scenes that we've already seen before. But what I was so impressed with this movie and the writing and the direction and everything was how they would go back and tell the same story without it being too much of the same. Like it was so interesting how every time they went back, it was like some of the same scenes, but they didn't show all of the same scenes, you know? It's like they kind of went back and emphasized obviously like different things from the different characters' perspectives, but I don't know, they did it without it being too repetitive or too redundant or too boring. And that was really, really well done. Like how they were very creative and how they chose to do that, because some of the scenes that they showed were the same, but obviously like the acting was different. Like they acted each scene out differently. Um depending on whose perspective it was. And like that was interesting enough to like keep you really engaged as the viewer and like really genuinely interested to see like how did this person view that interaction, you know? And so I noticed that as I was watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, like sometimes I hate like time travel movies and stuff because when they go back in time and it's like the same thing over again of what you already saw, it's like I just get like bored or whatever. And this movie was not that way. They like flip the timeline back to the beginning again twice, and both times that they went back and retold, it was not boring, it was not redundant or repetitive. They did enough different each time that it like was really interesting and engaging and kind of captivating, you know? And so all that was really good. And then what else? Like general impression. Um there's definitely some more like details I'd like to get into, but I'll pass it off to you before I do that. I guess the final like general impression was like they did a really good job. I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I thought they did a really good job of building up the last duel, like the final fight of the movie. Like I was so much like it was you really empathize with the characters by the end. So you're kind of like I was very much on the edge I felt like the Lady Marguerite or whatever, like watching the battle, like I felt like I was her. I was like literally thought to myself as I was watching them dueling, I was like, I don't know if I can stand to watch this. Like, I don't want to watch this. Like, it was that tense and like intense, and like there was so much at stake that you just like it's one of those things that like you feel like you almost can't watch it or don't want to watch it, but you have to know what happens. So you do watch it. And oh my gosh, they did a very good job like choreographing that last fight because you really don't know who's gonna win. Like, and I didn't know I had not heard what the ending of this movie was before, so I wasn't spoiled. I I know it's based off of a true story, but I did not know the outcome of the true story that it's based on, so I really had no idea. I thought that it was gonna be um Jean de Carouge or whatever that won because he is a knight and like a fighter, and the other guy was not as much of that. So I was like, of course, like the knight is gonna win the duel, like duh. But then when they actually did the fight, it was like very they were supposed to be older men by that point, like they're aging, and Jean de Carouge is clearly like getting older, so he's not at his peak fighting anymore. So it was like you do start to fear like, oh my gosh, like what if he loses, like I don't know. But yeah, that's that's like kind of my general impressions. But I thought it was a very high quality movie and very well told story. It was different from a lot of other films that try to show, I guess it's its own distinct movie. It's not just another like period drama or whatever. You know, it's got its own artistic flair to it and storytelling style to it, and that was really cool to see. And yeah, I thought it was good. There were a couple things that I didn't like as much, but mostly I really, really enjoyed it. Chi, how about you?
Yeah, I love this movie. When I watched it, I watched it a while ago when it first came out in theaters. Um, Yeah, I want to add that. So the screenplay was written by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck together, but they only did the first two parts. So the story
Oh,
was
okay.
told, from three perspectives. Like one of the two of the male protagonists and
Mhm.
the lady Marguerite at the
Mhm.
end.
Mhm.
And I saw this. Well, I knew this from an interview that they did. The last act, told from Lady Marguerite's perspective, was actually written by another writer they brought in,
Is
Nicole
that the Nicole?
Holofcener. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. They feel like they couldn't. They feel like they probably wouldn't do like the story, like the story justice, um, because they thought, oh, as men, they probably wouldn't have the experience that, or wouldn't empathize as much with Lady Marguerite as another, as a female writer, for example. So they decided to bring in Nicole Holofcener to write the last act, and yeah, I think she did a wonderful job, because I think the
she
last act was like the concluding, was like the, like the um like the pin, like, it was just the, the last act exposes all the hypocrisies and all the embellishments from the previous two perspective, the previous two stories. And so it's very important that the last act, was done right. And not that cannot happen until you have a really well written script. And Nicole Holofcener, I thought, did a really wonderful job with that. um so I
she
think the story was,
also
yeah,
I just want to say,
sure.
like, I noticed when the credits were rolling, like, she also was a producer for the movie. It was
Hmm.
like Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and Nicole Holofcener. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I said her last name right, but Holofcener.
I think, yeah, I
Um,
think that's
they
how.
they were producers and, like, executive producers, and
Hmm.
then yeah, that's cool. I see that she is one of the writers here, but I did not know that that's how they, like, kinda divided it up, that
Yeah,
she
yeah,
actually was the one
that's
that
what
was
they did.
writing.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah, that's what
cool.
they did.
That I
I think,
think that
yeah, I
was
think it's
smart.
it's a great thing that they did that, because I do
Mhm.
think, I mean, as talented as they both are, yeah, I think as men, you probably cannot like fully empathize or fully really imagine her situation and her like anger and frustration, in the same way a woman might. um so I really like the storytelling, because, you know when you have normally when you have something like, the same story told from different perspectives, it was the most of the time it was to create suspense, right? So like everybody was in a reliable narrator, so you don't know what happens, and the suspense was the purpose. And I think in this one is really interesting, because it's not really about suspense. It's really about exposing the two men. I mean, given the era, like how sort of male-centered and self-centered they both are. They both thought, oh, they are the hero of their own story, and they are like wronged by the other man. And but and then that's how we sort of, because I also didn't know how the story ended before going to the movie. So I thought, okay, well, it's about that. But then when you watched the last act, and you realize, oh, it's actually none of that was true. Like both men were horrible, like by maybe not so much by the standard of their time, but by the modern morality, is just they're just terrible people. um and they were both terrible to Lady Marguerite, but we didn't realize until we saw, I if I remember correctly, wasn't the last act named like The Truth or something?
This is actually one of this is probably my main complaint from this movie, is they, for each act, they had like chapter 1, the truth from Jean de
Yeah.
Carouge
Yes, yes.
perspective or whatever, and then
Yeah.
chapter 2, the truth from
Mhm.
Legree
Yeah,
perspective,
Legree.
and
Yeah.
then the chapter 3, the truth from Lady Marguerite's perspective, and then they disappeared all the text except for the words "the
The
truth,"
truth.
as if her perspective is the only actual true one, and the men's perspectives were not valid, but the woman's perspective was the actual truth. And it, in the sense of how they're choosing to tell the story, if they wanted it to be that her truth is the real truth, okay, fine. Like, they have the license to do that as storytellers. But I don't understand why they couldn't have just left it as the truth of Lady Marguerite's perspective and then let the audience decide, you know, what they think the actual, because the real truth of any story with any group of characters is that there's always going to be multiple people's perspectives. And even Lady Marguerite's perspective, as much as I do believe from the way that they told this story that Lady Marguerite's perspective of the actual rape is probably, I do believe that that is the truth, but the stuff before and after that incident was also her biased perspective of things. So I don't understand why they give her, like, I understand why, because it's like, I think the idea is, for so long, like, women weren't believed or listened to or didn't have a voice on these matters, so they're trying to give it to this character in this story as like she is the voice of truth in this story, and that's cool. I think, again, they have a license to do that as writers, but I think that, yeah, so the idea of this story was that her chapter or her act was the real truth, because they erased all the words except for the truth, because they say the truth according to
Yeah,
Lady
yeah,
Marguerite,
right,
and then they
right.
erase according to Lady Marguerite, and they just
Yeah, just
leave
yeah,
the
only just
truth.
the truth remains.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
And I think that they only did that for hers, so it was like indicating that her story is the real true story. And
yeah.
that's cool, but I do think, I think that that was like a little bit more, what is the word? Like, I understand that they're trying to give agency to the female character in this story, and that she does have a unique and valid perspective that is very, very valuable in this particular story, because she's the kind of she's the victim of this crime, so
Yeah,
she
yeah,
has
yeah.
like that very important perspective, and it's important for the audience to understand that perspective. But like, I just
No,
like, I
I
just,
think I think I
it's a
understand. I think I
political
can guess
thing.
what I think I can guess what your like problem issue with this might be. So I don't think they're trying to say that whenever something like this happens, you got to believe women no matter what. I don't think they're using this sort to really convey this message that whenever you have this sort of some sort of okay, well, because I think part of the story was that uh Jacques Legree believed that Lady Marguerite was trying to seduce him. Like she was interested in me. I was only like there to like save her from her miserable marriage. And so, I was being like like I was doing her a favor basically. Um I do think that its movie is not trying to preach the idea that only the women's perspectives are valid. But I do think it's using the stories to say, okay, well, in a lot of times when, you know, I mean, especially when probably back then, men can just interpret women's actions however they want. And if Jacques Legree decided that, oh, Lady Marguerite was interested in me, but just couldn't say it because she was trapped in a horrible marriage, then it doesn't really matter what she actually how she actually felt or what she actually thought. It doesn't matter at all. It is a little bit on the nose. I agree, but I
Yeah.
think
Well, and I think it was more towards Jean, her husband, John de Carouge, that like Matt Damon's character, that
mhm.
I was that's the part where like I just this is the thing. If you really want to give women agency in a story, you have to also admit that women also have, it's not that all women are perfect angels all the time. And they do paint Lady Marguerite as kind of like just she can do no wrong, basically, and that she is kind of like she's completely innocent in all of it, which I do believe, as far as the crime of the rape goes, she is totally innocent. Like, she did not bring it upon herself, she didn't ask for it, she didn't mean to indicate to Legree that she was interested in him in that way. She was trying to be loyal to her husband. Like, she was trying to do all the right things, and she did not want that to happen. I do believe in that case. But when it came to her interpretation, when it gets to her chapter and her interpretation of how her husband acts towards her, and it starts to paint him as like kind of
Yeah,
more cruel than his own perspective of how he is towards her.
yeah, yeah,
um
yeah.
it
I
provides
mean,
like a stark contrast, and I think that is definitely, there's truth to that too, that like he probably wasn't like he wasn't quite as heroic and great as a husband as he thought he was, but also she might be a little bit biased against him because she might feel some, she feels some resentment that isn't exactly his fault either, or that he's trying the best he can within the times that they're in to be a good husband to her or to protect her, and he failed. And it's just like, of course she's gonna
I
have her
yeah,
bias too, you know what I mean?
yeah, I get it,
So why
but
why
but
does
this
both
sounds
the
okay.
men,
Because yeah, well, because
why
he was
do why
horrible.
do they
He was a because he was a horrible husband. It's
but he
no,
wasn't, and he
I get it.
wasn't.
I get it. I mean, in by the standard of that time, maybe he's not so bad as a husband compared to all other men out there. But but he basically like uh a wife is like a property of the husband. Basically, that's what it was, right? And I really don't believe that, even though that was how things were at the time. I just don't think women were like, okay, well, I enjoy this treatment because as long as I have if my husband can provide me like financially, or then I'm like happy and content, even though like he just basically yeah, like she was a childbearing like vessel pretty much, like they're
But I don't think that that is what this movie is even. See, this is the thing, is I think if you took out that one little thing of where they erase all the words except for the truth for her perspective, it would change. I mean, it would just make it more equal in my mind between the three characters. Now, the one thing that I don't think is equal is, I think, I mean, this is my perspective as an audience member, is Legree, in my mind, he is the bad
yeah,
guy.
he
And
was like the worst of the two men, probably. Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's
and
fair to say that. Yeah,
I
but like, I
think
don't I yeah
Jean de Carouge was obviously like, I think,
I mean, he was a
he
brute, right?
like,
Like he wasn't he was not as like scheming and cunning, or like as yeah, like quote unquote evil as Jacques Legree, sure. And but the thing is, like, maybe the way I view
I
this
think
is that
she had,
I really didn't see. I thought the whole thing about it is that um I get it that you're trying to say argue that Lady Marguerite was also another unreliable narrator, right? Like maybe the all the instances where she felt like she was mistreated was just her own perception. Um, it wasn't actually like that. I mean, yes, I mean if you want to view the whole thing like this way, sure. I mean, I accept that. But I really thought the whole thing about the movie was that back then women were not treated as equal as men. They were treated as properties, even as sort of high status as Lady Marguerite was at the time. Still, like she was not respected as a human being. I think that much is true. I think it's fair to say that. And I agree. Maybe at the time, women wouldn't have the vocabulary or the attitude or the power to really voice her whatever frustration or anger, like Lady Marguerite did in the movie. Maybe that was a little out of place, because we don't really know how women would voice their opinions in the time, or if they would actually be able to do that. But I do believe that if you would, and nobody would be happy if you would just treat it as somebody's property. Like even that was
but
the
I
mainstream idea. I just don't think that's, yeah.
but I think it's,
I
I guess what I'm trying to say is like this movie did a great thing where it is kind of promoting, or it's kind of, it is like almost, I guess you could say it's like a feminist story, but not in like, I feel like it's not like a new wave feminist story. It's like a very like traditional, like, yes, like women did not have the same rights as men like back during these times. Like they were, there was a lot that was controlled by men that they had no control over, and this story shows that very clearly. And and like I think today we all, or at least in most society, or maybe not most, but in a lot of societies today, we agree that 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 is not the ideal way of structuring your society, that women should have equal rights to men and they should not be treated as property and all of this. But I do believe that this story also shows that it is more complicated than just that. Like I do believe that they show that these characters were true characters. Like they paint these characters as true people that existed in their time and were operating within the constraints of their time. And so as a result of that, yes, there were constraints, especially on Lady Marguerite. And yes, a lot of her fate was left up to the decisions of the men in her life, which is by modern standards very much not fair. But I also believe that the story showed that Jeanne de Carouge and Lady Marguerite did have some love and affection for each other. It wasn't total. I mean, when it gets to her perspective, her perspective does paint him as a lot more uh rough and brutish, as you said, Chi, than how his perspective, when in
yeah,
his
which
perspective,
I thought was the whole point.
he shows that he has like, I mean, it looks like from his perspective, like he genuinely does cherish her as his wife, that he does have love for her, and that he is kind and understanding towards her when it comes to her not being able to bear him in air and stuff like that. She obviously emphasizes from her perspective the more like negative things that he says to her, because that's true for every person. Whenever we're every person from their perspective, we're going to dwell on where the things that stand out in our minds are the ways that others have maybe acted negatively towards us or mistreated us, because those are the more dangerous things. So I'm trying to say is I like looking at this movie like her perspective is like the valid third perspective that helps the audience really draw conclusions about what actually happened when it came to this crime, but that some of her perspective is also undoubtedly going to be a little bit biased towards her self interest as well. Because to act like women aren't also, you know, self interested, just like any human being is, and that women also don't have a bias is crazy. So, but I think this story did a really good job of showing that each character had their own unique perspective, and the real truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It's like the Lady Marguerite is correct that she was raped. Like that claim was true, and she was speaking the truth according to this story. But also, it's a and also type of situation where also I do also believe the truth is also that um Legree also thought in his twisted mind that is obviously skewed from his previous relationships with like prostitutes and stuff. um he thought that he wasn't wronging her in the moment. Like he thought that this was just the game that they were playing, and that he had a right to, well, maybe he didn't think he had a right because he like confessed his sin afterwards, but like he thought that she was wanting it. And that is also part of the truth. Now, does that make it right at all? No, it does not. And I believe that his character was, despicable in many, many ways. But I also think that like the truth between the relationship between the Lady Marguerite and her husband, and then also her mother-in-law, like that is probably a little bit different. Like her perspective on that is probably a little bit biased towards her own self-interest in that case. And she probably emphasizes in her mind all of the negative things. Now, I also believe that according to how this story is told, that Jean de Carouge, by modern day standards, was, you know, treated her poorly in many instances, and also even at one point physically assaults her and kind of like forces her into a couple of, it seems from her perspective that there were some times where she was kind of coerced or forced into having sexual relationship with him during times when she really didn't want to. So, but that is probably a reality of the truth of how marital relationships operated during that time in this place as well. So that is actually accurate. I mean I think it probably is. I don't know because I'm not a historian, but like, I
Yeah,
just
but I
think
mean,
that
but with all that said, what room is left there for for there to be? I mean, yes, I mean, it's so.
I just think that the movie did a good job of showing
Uh,
that these characters were like existing within their time without like passing too much judgment. And it's like, yes, the men were harsh, and John de Carouge was like kind of brutish, but partially because he had to be, because he was a freaking knight that had seen many, many battles and like
oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
had
sure, yeah,
been,
of course. I mean, his mind is probably twisted by all the battle he had to do, and yes, I think it makes sense that why men would be that way because it's all about
yes,
like
exactly.
forceful masculinity. Like we talk about toxic masculinity nowadays, that is even like tuned to like 1,000 back then. Yes, I think that all makes sense why he would be that way. But I
I
you know
just think it's I guess with
I think this is where maybe like our views diverge from here, which is I don't believe the even like this just not talk about the rape because I think that's pretty, there's no gray area there. But even about the marriage, the experience in a marriage, I just don't think the way I saw it is that uh I didn't believe Lady Marguerite was embellishing her experience, but I do think Jean de Carouge was. Maybe there was, of course, when they were first getting married, it was, yeah, like it was nice and all that, but then, as the story depicted, it was it deteriorated very very soon after that. Like, not for long, she was pretty much like a property, right? And yeah, you can say I do believe
But
that.
she still felt like that. What? How do you explain then? Like, she did feel. It seemed like even from her perspective, she showed loyalty to her husband. Like, I think she felt some. She felt that marital bond with him, and I think she felt in some instances she did feel protected by him, and she felt like he was providing. Like
Yeah,
she
yeah, no,
says,
yeah. I mean,
my
yes, that,
husband
but
provides
right,
for
right, right,
me.
right. But
You
even
know.
but this kind of thing, yeah, I think she was bound by a moral code, right? Not because she was happy, because she had no choice, really. What else could she have done? Like divorce him? I mean, the thing is, like, she
No,
was
I think
trapped. She was trapped in that marriage, right? Like, yes, she was protected. She was like provided for, but that doesn't, like, I don't think that really means that she is overall she feels like positive about the whole thing, right? Like, nowadays a woman can just get up and leave, right? But back then it wasn't a choice. And I just don't think, yeah, I don't think she was bound. Yes, she was bound to the marriage, but I do not think it was by, I don't think, it didn't feel like to me that it was she was bound by like love or anything like that. It was more about like she was bound by morality, or just a lack of choice, really.
well, I'm not trying to say like if Lady Marguerite existed in modern times, she probably wouldn't have necessarily chosen that man to be her husband. Like if it were up to her, I think that that
Hmm.
is true, but that's not what this story is showing. It's not showing people in a modern day context. I think it did that's what I
No, no,
loved
but
about
no,
it so
but
much
no, but
is
exactly,
that
exactly. That
it's
is because
telling
if a
it's
woman,
it's telling like a feminist story in the time of when this takes place, which I love seeing rather than what you often see these days, which is movies that judge the past by modern day context. And I feel like this movie, of course, our modern day biases are going to come into it as we're watching the movie, but I think the actual story of how this movie was told did a good job of showing, even with our modern day biases, it showed how these people were attempting to live genuine, authentic, and like high quality lives in their time, or like they were fighting for, I mean, in their own ways, were trying to do right by, well, maybe not Adam Driver's character, but like I just think that like from the husband, if you think back to Jean de Carouge's perspective, like there were things he was doing where he, in his mind, he was putting it into context, like I'm doing this for my wife, or I'm doing this for my family, or whatever. Like it was interesting that in Jean de Carouge's perspective, he emphasizes the fact, he shows this in his mind, it shows all of this whole scene where about that parcel of land that he was supposed to get in her dowry, that he doesn't actually receive because the her father had already given it away to pay a debt. So in his perspective, he has the whole scene where she walks out with him and she's talking to him about how much she loves that piece of land, and how she like wants to return to it or something. He has a memory of her saying those things about how much she loved that parcel of land. Now, he probably also has an interest in that parcel of land for the wealth that it gives him, for the value of the land, the money he could make off of it, like all that. But she has like an emotional attachment to it. He emphasizes that in his mind, and that plays into him going to court or whatever and suing the Pierre, because he believes he wants to get that piece of land back, but in his mind he's partially doing that for the desire of his wife, to try to please her. Also, he shows in his mind that he says yes to attending the celebration where Legree is, um partially because it seemed like that would be pleasing to his wife. He's doing things to be pleasing towards her. When it gets to her perspective, all of that is omitted, as if she has no memory of
Well,
that,
yeah,
and that she's
but
just
the reason I
purely
thought, because it was all embellishment. I think this is exactly where we diverge in our opinion on this. I just don't think that, like, all the, I said something about the two men. They are both heroes in their own stories, according to their point of view.
yes. Yeah.
So all these like nice things, like, they're being considerate, being selfless. It's all embellishment. That's how I see it.
But
I don't
don't
think
you
the truth
think
is. I don't think the truth
But
is somewhere.
don't you think there's also a chance that Lady Marguerite did ask her? I mean, in her perspective, when it gets to her perspective, they go to there's no she has no memory, or it doesn't show her memory of her going to her husband to ask him to go. But it does show later on to the celebration where at Legree's place, or whatever. And she has no memory of that moment where she walks up to the stable and like asks him, can we go to this party? And he says yes. She doesn't recall that part. She recalls later on, once they're already at the party and they're dancing, and she's talking to him about being, you know, I'm glad you decided to come to this. Don't you see how like being nice and putting a smile on your face like does more good than, like she's arguing her point that like you should make amends with your friend, with your old friend or whatever. So she does have some memory of she was pleased that he decided to go to the party. She just doesn't recall the part where she asked. Now,
Well, yeah,
again, it's a thing
okay,
in
but here's the thing. Like,
it's a thing in
you think
her.
she didn't recall? You think she like forgot about? It's all like
No,
selective memory, right? But I just don't think she didn't recall, because it never happened that way. That's how I took it. It never. It wasn't like, the
okay.
Jean de Carouge didn't, like, it was never about pleasing his wife. It was, if anything, it was just his own excuse for because if he because the
Yeah.
real reason would make him look weak, would diminish his status. He's like, oh, I'm not gonna be the one that like stoop down and like make amends first, because that's gonna diminish my masculinity. So he's not gonna do that. Or, if he does that, he's not gonna admit that that was the reason. So I really thought that was the whole point, is that men
But
back
see,
in the story, they just
mm,
embellish. They they either in their mind, or when they told somebody else, sort of recounted the stories. It's all about making themselves to be more honorable than they actually are. It's all
well,
embellishment.
and I think
And
that
again, I'm not saying that all men are like that, right? I don't think this movie is trying to say, oh, women are can never be fault. It's always honest and honorable. But men, they're like, oh, they are this and this and that. I don't think it's this. It's just that in within the context of the story, set in that, back in like the 16th century or something, 17th century, that was what happened. It was like, both men, they're all like horrible, to different degrees in different ways. And this honest woman, again, not representing all women in the world. Yes, women can be treacherous, can be dishonorable. Sure. I mean, there's no argument about, there's no argument in that. But like, at least in the story, I thought like Lady McGree was an honest and honorable woman, but because of her situation, she was like, you know, she was either like the object or the excuse that the men make, or she was the object um of men's projection about their own desires, and because women were like powerless basically at the time, so all these things happened to her, and and if based on how history was written, like her story would never see the light of day because nobody cares. um I thought the movie was like the whole thing was to highlight this situation. I think in some to some extent still like persists to this day. Of course not to the same extent, but like, you know still, like, if you think about
I just
like
think,
all the
oh,
like the
sorry, go ahead.
sexual assault victims, and how we still have like, just talk about like Hollywood actresses. Like, there are women that never got to work again because they refused the advancement of some powerful figure in the industry. It doesn't really, it just, we're talking about something that happens in the past like 2 decades. So I do think this story is like a um
But at the same time, it's as cruel and awful as those times were back in
yeah,
those times, as as rough and kind of brutish or cruel as men could be back in those days, possibly because of the standards of what they had to be in order to survive in that time, and also women who were forced to be quiet and not speak of these things in those times because of what those times were like, and how risky that was for them to speak out, as this movie shows. As awful as all that is, at the end of this dang movie, and as crazy as it is that they decided to let this go, to that they had this mentality of like, oh, well, this duel will decide who is innocent and who is guilty. That by our modern day standards is also wild, because it's like, there was no trial by jury or anything like that. They would bring it to court, but like the court was very biased, because the Pierre, whatever, the king and Pierre and Legree were all in alignment, and all that. At the end, they do, because Carouge in a sense got lucky and wins the fight, and Legree is deemed the guilty one, and he's obviously dead. But they punish that crime so severely, like, like they hang him up in the streets and drag him through the streets, and that's also kind of, you watch that and you're like, wow, that's really vicious as well. But it's like, they did have those times were very rough times, and if you were condemned as a rapist, like, you were viewed as the most like vile of criminals, and in some sense, like, today, I'm not saying at all that we should treat people, even criminals, like that harshly, but in another sense, today we do not treat rapists like some, maybe the punishment, I'm not saying that that should be the punishment, that's crazy, trust me, do not take my words the wrong way, but I'm saying, like, I feel like what you're talking about, Chi, with Hollywood, or like big powerful figures getting away with like raping people, it's like there's not the same level of public condemnation of that as there used to be, in a sense. Like, even though back in those times it took a lot more to prove that anything even happened, it's like when if it was proven or if the person was found guilty, the punishment was so harsh. Like it was death. It was literally you would be killed
Yeah, I mean, back in the
if
day,
you
all the
were
punishments are most
accused.
severe. Like if you steal something, you got your hands cut off, right? Like back in the
Yeah.
day, it was how the law works.
Yeah.
It's like extreme
Yeah.
punishment, not just
Yeah.
for raping, but for all kinds of crime. Like you
Yeah.
just multiply
Yeah.
our modern punishment by like
Yeah.
1,000. That's what you get.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that is true. That is very true.
So it's just like it's just an interesting contrast, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I do think that that is what maybe we where we had you and I Chi had different like viewed this movie differently in a few ways is just like I believe that the story indicates that both of the male protagonists or main characters, I don't know if they're protagonists, they're kind of antagonists, but both of the male main characters were portrayed like as doing some pretty vile or bad things, and they were acting in their own self-centered way. Like I do think when it gets to Lady Marguerite's perspective and she calls out her husband for even just signing up for the duel, or I don't know, promoting the duel as him acting in his own self-interest, and he's like, I'm risking my life for you, and she's like, no, you're risking my life so that basically your ego can be served. Like you can do that. You're
Yeah,
risking my life for your pride is what she kind of says back to him. And he does have like, I do think that that is a true part of, a very honest part of the story too, where she's pointing out that even when he thinks or in his mind, when he thinks he's doing something for her or to protect her, he's actually doing it for his own pride in a sense.
yeah, yeah.
And
I
I
mean,
think that that's
yeah.
true, but I also this is where I think we just
But wouldn't that
maybe
just prove like
disagree.
all his previous, all his memories about him being like he doing things
No,
just
cuz
for her sake is all his own like illusion? Wouldn't
well,
that just prove that well, that's what happened?
this is where I think we maybe like slightly had different takes on this, cuz I think that it's true, yes, that he embellishes his story and that he's under this illusion that everything he's doing is out of this like honorable, like he's being this honorable man and good husband, and he doesn't remember the parts where he really badly mistreats her, like he physically assaults her or like, you know, forces her to have sex with him right after she was raped, like,
Yeah, yeah,
like
but isn't that enough? Like,
he
what
doesn't
is there?
he
What
doesn't
else is to be said about him as a husband?
no. Okay, so that is true. But to also pretend like he did nothing at all, like that men of those times never did anything to please their wives or out of wanting to please their wives or have a positive,
Well, but that's
happy
the thing. Like, how do
relationship
you?
with
But
their
how do
wives
you?
is
How? But how do
crazy.
you know? But how do you know he is doing that to please his wife? Like,
Because
like
in
the
his
final thing
version,
just
he is. In his version of the
right, right.
story,
But the
he
scene you just mentioned showed us that he's not reliable. Like he, of course, he's always gonna think that, oh, I'm just doing this for I'm being a good husband. But of course, I mean, it's possible that yes, he did do that before. But I thought like that scene, the whole purpose was just to show that no, he's not like that. All the horrible things that he did his wife in his memory, he is just, well, I'm just asking my wife to do her duty, or I'm doing this just to like please my wife or be a good husband. But in fact, no, he's just doing this for his own sake. He lives in
I
in his idea of what a good husband should be based on the standard of the time. But still, like,
I just don't buy that, like, men back then, or even this particular character, like, I do think that that's maybe this is what all I'm trying to say is, like, maybe that's part of Lady Marguerite's perspective, that in her perspective, he is purely self-centered, prideful, and brutish, and kind of treats her poorly in every way, or only treats her as property. But I don't think that that is necessarily, I think it's more nuanced than that, where I think he is also trying in many instances to do right by her, of what he believes is how he's supposed to do that as her husband in those times. I'm not
Right, right,
saying
right,
that
right.
that
No,
is
I know, I agree
correct.
with you. But the thing is that I guess my issue with this is that, but all this behavior, because other than the fact that he just went out and just he's working. He's kept working and working and working, to put it simply. Yes, you can say the motivation was to provide for his wife, but it can also be explained by the fact that he just wants to boost his self-esteem, right? So I I just, given all that happened, like, yeah, he assaulted her, he like basically raped her. It's hard for me to give him this leeway and say, okay, well, he is, or it just reminds me so much of, like, when you hear this like domestic violence victims, and they say something like, yeah, other than the time that he like beats me and raped me, like, he is a good husband. It just reminds me so much of that sort of narrative, or I don't know. Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe
No,
he is
no, I'm
he when
not
he went out
saying.
and because that's basically what he is. Like, yeah, I mean, other than the fact that he's been out there, like, acquiring land, like trying to make money by putting himself in danger, like being in battle, basically. Yes, he's trying to, like, provide for the family.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what he did, right? But is it
To act like
really
men weren't also in a very harsh, like, that wasn't a very harsh time period
right?
for
I
men
I know, I
too,
know, I
is
know.
crazy.
Yes,
And I think what it is
but
I
that
think a
doesn't
lot
mean.
of
But even
times we
even
over
then, even
exaggerate.
back then, maybe. But even back then, I just don't think it's. I don't believe even back then, like, that's how uh, couples would have sex in the bedroom. It's basically like, men would just like coerce the wife. I just don't. I don't know. I just don't. It's hard for me to imagine that was a, even back then, it was a happy and normal and marriage. Even though, yes, he's been out there, he's not just sitting around and just did nothing. Yeah, I mean, yes, he's working. He's been working hard, but
Yeah, like, he made
I
sacrifices,
just
but
don't. Yeah.
she also did, and or she made some, I mean, some sacrifices that she was forced to make, and that's the difference, is he got to choose what he had more choice. He has more choice in what sacrifices he's going to make in life than she does. She just is kind of like forced into sacrificing certain things, if that makes sense. Like, she just has to go along with. But I guess I just am saying, like, I think that um her perspective is very valid, and was, like, obviously the climax of this movie and this story, and that was really I even thought about this at before we even got to her chapter.
Hmm.
um I even thought about it, like, as I was watching, I think, the second part, where it's Legree's perspective. um the order in which they show these perspectives is really, like, that makes a huge difference for this story. The fact that they chose Jean de Carouge's first, Legree's second, and Lady Marguerite's third, like if they had switched that around in any other orientation, like it would tell a very different story, right? And so that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting too. And I thought about that, like how interesting that would be also if they had shown like Jean de Carouge's perspective after showing Lady Marguerite's, or even showing Legree's after showing Lady Marguerite's, like how that would have changed how you interpreted certain things. But I'm not saying that's what they should have done at all. I think that they obviously chose the correct order to put things in and told the story in the way that was most effective and impactful, and it was very effective and impactful, and you really empathize with Lady Marguerite. And but you kind of get somewhat of a chance to empathize a little bit with each character, despite how like vile the men are at
Yeah.
times,
Well,
especially
I
Legree.
did. Yeah, I did when I was going through the first two parts, because
Mhm.
I thought, yeah, in taking out, if we ignore anything that concerns the Lady Marguerite, if you just look at the conflict, or you know the 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 feud between Legree and the Carouge. Yes, I think each of them has. I think I did have more sympathy towards the Carouge when I was
Mhm.
watching Legree's part,
Mhm.
because he was like all scheming the whole time. Um, but I've got to say that,
And he's
you know,
in a lot of ways
but a
Legree
lot
is
of
even
my
more
sympathy
full of
is just it.
himself.
I mean, they both are maybe in different ways, but because they're different
Yeah.
people. But I have to say, I do have to say, my like sympathy towards either of the men sort of evaporated very fast, when I watched the last act, because yeah, because they just turned out to be horrible in different ways.
Well, I agree. I agree based off of Lady Marguerite's perspective, but
Yeah,
that's why, I mean,
I
and that's
I,
how
I
they
guess I get,
painted the
yeah.
story
Right.
for
I guess
sure.
it all depends on, maybe this is one of the genius of the movies, that it based
Mhm.
on who you believe.
Yeah,
I choose to believe that Lady Marguerite's story was the quote
the
unquote the
most
truth.
accurate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like
Well,
she
that's
didn't
what they
embellish.
say.
That's
Yeah.
that's what they say, and I choose to believe that's what happens. She didn't embellish any of it. That was her experience.
Yeah.
That was the truth.
Yeah.
Of
And I
course,
guess
you can sort of flip it on its head and say, okay, well, you told me that is the truth, but maybe she was also just another biased character that somehow neglected certain crucial information of the story and portrayed.
why not?
Why not?
I
Exactly.
I guess just cuz like I guess I just view it as, I mean, how you interpreted it, I think, is the intention of how they want it to be interpreted,
Yeah.
the creators of this. And this
And also, I believe
screenplay.
the spirit of the movie. I think
Yeah.
it wanted
Yeah.
us to see things this way, and that's how, that
Yeah.
was the message. But
Yes.
yes, you can argue, well, I don't want to believe it this way. I want to believe that the truth is somewhere in the middle of the three perspectives. Sure, nobody can tell
That's
you
what
not to think that.
I just want it, or I just wished after I saw literally from the moment it comes on chapter 3, the truth according to Lady Marguerite, and then it disappears the words. I was like, dang it. Like I just wanted her perspective to be given like not more but equal weight to the other perspectives, and then let the audience decide who they believe. And I think the audience would have still concluded, like I and you would have still concluded the same thing, even if they hadn't like really blatantly pointed out that like her truth is the real truth. It's like I think it would have then just given it even what's the beauty of this story is the nuance of it. And like I would say one of my favorite parts of the whole movie was seeing, I mean, the acting was just so good in particularly my favorite, I think, part. of the acting was seeing the differences between the three interpretations of when Lady Marguerite, when they go to the party and De Carouge tells her to give him the kiss, tells Lady Marguerite to give Legree the kiss, and seeing her acting between those three different perspectives was so good. It was so
Yeah.
nuanced, and just the tiniest little body language differences between Carouge's perspective, Legree's perspective, and her perspective. It was just, that was so well done. And that is, I think, the kind of like that little moment in all three perspectives is kind of the anchoring point almost, where that is the difference between, but it's not said in dialogue, it's not done by words, it's purely done based off of her acting, the female actresses acting of Lady Marguerite's reaction, or how her body language is during that interaction. And very well done by Jodie Comer. I think the
Mm-hmm.
director Ridley Scott obviously probably had a lot of instructions there, and I don't even know how they wrote that, like how they described it in the writing of the screenplay or whatever. But so that all of that was like very well executed, and I think is like the beauty of this movie is boiled down in that one scene. If you copied and pasted it side by side between the three different perspectives, and that is the beauty of this movie. And I like that. I like that nuance. I like seeing that. I like the fact that they showed these characters within their times, instead of pure like showing it with like tons and tons of judgment towards one or the other. Like at the end when you're watching the duel, for instance, you're probably rooting for one side. Like I was rooting for Lady Marguerite in that battle. Like I
Oh yeah, me
honestly
too.
did.
Yeah.
I think that's what the movie does really well, is it gets to a point where you're almost like, I don't care what happens to either of these men. I just don't want Lady Marguerite to die. Like I don't want her to have to be burned at the stake. Like that was wild. Like that fear that she has was like palpable when you're watching that scene of, she's hoping for the outcome of her husband, not even for her own sake as much as, well, it is partially for her own sake, but it's also out of concern for her child, which the movie doesn't really, the child has blonde hair, but it doesn't really indicate if that child was Legree's or De Carouge's child. I mean, they in
Mm-hmm.
the movie they say like, oh well, the child cannot be the product of rape, so it has to be De Carouge's. But maybe that's what the characters believed, living in that time. But like for us, the audience, we don't really
Yeah,
know
we
whose
don't know.
child it even is.
Yeah,
But
I think it was, yeah.
she still loves that child and cares about it. And that's another thing she points out to De Carouge is, she says, did you think about the fact that you're going to make your son an orphan? When you go out and do this duel, if you lose, like now our son's going to be an orphan. So she was also thinking about the child. And I thought that that was really an emotional part of the movie as well. And so for her to get the chance to actually see him grow up and everything is like what I was rooting for. And yes, you just like almost don't care, but at the same time you don't want to watch, like that's what I was trying to say at the beginning of this whole conversation, is like the whole battle or the whole duel, I'm like almost don't want to watch it, because it's like I don't want to see either of these men like brutally die, but I also want one of them to win. But I also can't watch this because it's like too intense. And so it's just like really effective at playing on all those emotions, playing on all those nuances, and kind of cultivating even the smallest amount of empathy for each character, even the two men, despite the fact that they were both had very ugly and vile tendencies about them that are despicable. But you also like kind of hate to see them have to be brutally fighting each other to the death. It's like, gosh, like there's no other way this could get resolved. And it just goes to show that like when like the duel was the result not only of the rape, but of like a long period of like discrepancy between these two men. And that's the other crazy part of this whole story is it's not just this crime of the rape, which should be enough just in and of itself to warrant, you know, punishment or whatever of that rapist, but like her word should be enough. But honestly, in this story, it's more than just her word that goes into it. It's also the fact that these two men already hated each other before. And this was just like one more thing on top of it all. So it's just like a very nuanced and complicated story. And the characters have multiple motivations going on. Each character does, and reasons for why they make the decisions they make, even if you totally disagree with those decisions. And like, as awful as I thought it, like, I was shocked when you're watching Lady Marguerite's perspective and Jean de Carouge like goes up and when he like strangles her, like after she tells him that she was raped, and he like he like is that's when he like physically assaults her. He like strangles her, like, are you telling me the truth? And all that. And it's like, that was very, very brutal and wrong of him to treat her that way. Of course, when he's telling the story, he omits that entire part of the interaction. Like in his memory, I guess, or however they're doing this, he is like understanding and kind and like, you know, immediately wants to go and get justice or whatever. But in her version, she remembers that he was very emotional and angry and physically assaults her in that moment. And that like took me aback because I wasn't expecting that, because that was not part of his memory. So we hadn't seen that before. But then I was thinking about it afterwards and I was like, man, like that was really wrong of him to do that. But I was like, at the same time, again, being a product of the times that they're in, the character knows how risky this is for her to be making this claim too, because it's a risk to so much. It's a risk to everything. It's a risk to her life for her to be saying this. It's a risk for his pride too. It's a risk for his life, because now he's gonna have to go and challenge this person. So it's like, of course, he's like threatening her and he's treating her very brutally in that moment. But also you can kind of imagine how a man in that time would have had such a strong reaction, especially such a guy who is hardened by battle, or who is very physically violent in by his nature, because that's what he has had to cultivate within himself in order to survive as a knight in that era. And of course that comes out of him in that moment, because it's a very emotionally charged moment. I'm not saying it's right. I think it was, again, it took me aback. I was like, whoa, that was really too much. Like, he shouldn't have done that. Obviously, like, any woman who's confessing something like that to her husband that she did not ask for or want, and for him to then be like physically kind of punishing her for saying those words is, by modern day standards, that is crazy, because she didn't want that to happen to her. She didn't want to have to confess that to him. She just had to say it because she didn't want to she had to tell him what happened, because she knew he was gonna she didn't want to have sex with him, basically, because she had just been raped. And so she was having to confess this thing that she didn't ask for, and then she's getting physically assaulted for it again by her husband, who supposedly she has some level of maybe affection or care for, since they are in this marital relationship. And now he is like punishing her for even making the claim, and that is wrong and brutal and vile and everything. But you do also, it helps put into perspective the stakes when a claim like this is made during that time, because it was risky to everything, and it was a risk to her life to even say that out loud. And it's kind of like what her mother-in-law says to her later, when the mother-in-law was like, I was raped, but I didn't say anything, because basically her mother-in-law, it sucks because that's what it was like back then, and women couldn't speak out about these things. But it was a risk to your life and your family's life and your child's life, if you said something, because you might not be found innocent in that matter. And then, next thing you know, you're being burned at the freaking stake. So I'm not saying any of that is right. I'm just saying the nuance of this story, even with all the violence and all of the abuse and criminal acts that were shown in this movie, I thought that's what was really impressive about it too, because these are very sensitive subjects that obviously today in modern times we have a lot of thoughts and opinions about. And there's like a political aspect to it, but an emotional one as well for a lot of people. So to see a movie like treat these very sensitive subjects in a very realistic way, but also in a way that feels in some sense like emotionally gratifying at the end, or like, I don't know if it's emotionally gratifying, but like it just feels like it was portrayed in a honest, nuanced way that you don't get to see these stories told in that way very often. So that I really appreciated about this. So I know I just blabbered on for a long, long time, but I guess I was just trying to describe more of like what I was trying to say earlier. Not exactly that I think that Matt Damon's character was like the actual hero of the story, and Lady Marguerite is lying about her perspective on him. No. I don't think that that's the case at all. I'm just saying I appreciate the nuance that they put in there, and that you can even understand a little bit of how these men did act kind of brutally towards Lady Marguerite. You can almost like start to grasp at like some of like why maybe they were acting that way towards this woman. And maybe that is indicative of how other men also, or just the situations of men and women back in those times, and how there were other instances of men also probably treating their wives like that, and that is wrong by today's standards. But you can kind of see how the stakes were different back then. The stakes were really high, and people were probably more violent back then, and that doesn't excuse it or make it okay, but it just is what it is. And that was a realistic portrayal of that. And it's crazy how they even cultivate a little bit of empathy even for those characters when they are being very vile towards this woman, which is, yeah, even the freaking like rapist character, like I didn't like his character at all, like even from when it was in his perspective, like I still didn't empathize with him that much. But I like, you can kind of understand how he like misread the signals, I guess. I mean, it's still a little
Because he's
crazy, but
narcissistic. Like he's just
yeah.
narcissistic. Of course, he's gonna
Yeah.
look at anything and say, "Oh yeah, she's like so into me." Like that was a bit obvious
Yeah.
from the beginning. Like he is just a self-centered uh narcissist. So
Yeah.
it only makes sense that he would like totally read the signs wrong and just thought, "Oh wow." He was just dreamed up this whole thing about, oh, she is like so unhappy in the marriage, but
Yeah.
she's like has like
Exactly.
secret love for me. Obvious. I mean, it makes total sense he would think that way.
Yeah.
Um,
And
my
men
overall.
do that too. Like there
Oh
guys
yeah, of course,
and women
yes. I mean,
women do it too. Like they blow things up in their minds of like,
oh
"Oh,
yeah,
he
yeah. I mean,
feels this way
yes,
about
yes, yes.
me or
Of
she
course,
feels this way about
narcissism.
me." Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's not like a male specific thing. Both sex, both yeah. We have narcissists, men and women. They're all there out there. I guess my feeling was that it just sucks so bad to be a woman living at a time. And as far removed as the times was from now, like I said, there are still a lot of women who were like mistreated and abused, but had to bear the brunt end of that, of the consequence through no fault of their own at all.
Mhm.
And it's been what, like 6 centuries since things like that was happening, but still, it's because we are still in pretty much like a patriarchy. um and it also, like, it's kind of scary to think about, because of that, like how many people, men and women, when they are the target of abuse, they would still like unconsciously try to like make excuse for the abuser, or somehow like blame themselves for it. Oh, was it because I did something wrong? Was it because I give that person the wrong idea when I did this and did that? It's kind of, yeah. I mean, that's what I was left with. Like this, it's just this horror of things like that still happening in the world. Um, yeah. I
I
did
think
wonder though.
I
Like
just
I
I
did.
guess I'm just trying maybe from the female perspective it's like I obviously empathize with Lady Marguerite's character from that perspective of being also like in my case like also a woman, and if I had been alive during those times, like my fate might have been even worse than what, because she was like a pretty like noble lady. So if you were
Mhm.
just a peasant lady, I mean they had the line in there about like how are you any different than the peasant women that the men take when they're in battle, when they're off like fighting their
Yeah,
wars and they go
yeah, which is very,
and
which is very true. Yeah.
but at the same time it's like the peasant women I don't know, there's I mean it's I guess it's always been that way that there's like pluses and minuses, because in some sense if you're a low value woman you might be like as far as like wealth, like there if there's not much wealth attached to you, um maybe you would be safer in some ways, but in other ways you're very vulnerable because you're poor and you could be, your husband or whatever might not have as much power to protect you. Anyways, if I had been alive in those times, my experience probably would have been more similar to Lady Marguerite's, obviously, than either of the two male characters. Um, and so I can empathize with that, but I also like maybe want to point out like from I just want to point out that men were also living in brutal times during that time too. It wasn't easy for them either, and they were
Hmm.
making very big sacrifices and taking
Oh
serious
yeah, no,
risks in order to
yeah, I think
protect.
men, yeah, I do think, yes,
You know
I
what I
think
mean?
I agree. I think men are also victims of this toxic masculinity, for sure. Like they even though they could be, some of them could be the abusers, but the fact that they become, they they could have, turned out to be better person than they actually are. And the fact that this society somehow make them believe that they are, they can just treat people like objects, is just unfortunate. And for the humanity as a whole, yeah, I mean, the whole human race is worse because of that. So yes, I think men are also, and also, because uh if you're a man and you subscribe to the idea of masculinity, then yeah, you're gonna do a lot of things that are not actually good for you at all, but you couldn't help it.
Well, I have to say I don't think that all I don't want to get into a whole other conversation because we probably have to like wrap this up kind of soon. But I just
Hmm.
have to say, like, I don't think that masculinity, I think that there's goodness in masculinity just like there's goodness in femininity.
Sure,
And
sure, sure,
not
yeah.
all
No,
masculinity
no, no,
is
no, no, not
bad.
at all.
And
Yeah, toxic masculinity,
I guess
toxic. That
that's
is.
just what I don't even like using that phrase though, because like everybody has different interpretations of what that even means. And some people's version of good masculinity is someone else's definition of toxic masculinity. So I understand that this story was definitely pointing out some aspects of the negative side of, I guess, like masculine aggressiveness and the the ways things were back when society was really patriarchal, like more than today, and when like women didn't have equal rights. Like I understand that that was not, society has progressed since then, thank God. There has been progression, and yes, there are still many instances of men getting away with certain crimes that women can't confess publicly without taking on such great risk to their own selves and their own reputations and everything. But we are slowly progressing. Women have gained a lot more rights today than they had back then. There has been an evolution of many different like views and how society is structured and how marriage is viewed and everything else. But I do think even back then there were many men and many women that were living in that society that had genuine positive aspects to them, obviously, but also that genuinely loved each other and genuinely cared for each other and made sacrifices for each other. And that wasn't always the case in every marriage or in every relationship between men and women. But I just, I guess I also saw in this story a little bit of, as much as it really does emphasize the Lady Marguerite's experience at the end, it kind of emphasized it did a good job of like kind of equally showing in some ways though, like the three different experiences that were involved here, and showing that there were three characters with very unique perspectives and viewpoints that were very different from each other's and that had their own version of the truth. And yeah, I don't know, it was just, it did a good job, I think, of showing all the different, I guess, sufferings of the three characters in some ways. But you probably empathize with some characters more than others, as you should, because some characters such as Lady Marguerite, were definitely more innocent in all of this than the others. But I think that some of like the male characters um masculinity weren't all bad. I mean, maybe Legree, he was kind of skeezy, but kind of. He was very skeezy, but I guess I had some sympathy. I guess what I'm trying to say is I had some sympathy for Jean de Carouge. And I did find it interesting cuz I did think Matt Damon was an interesting casting choice for him because he looked very like I guess maybe it was next to Adam Driver. He looks very stocky and kind of like short.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't look like he'd be this like great knight, really. I mean, he looks strong, but he looks very stocky. And um, I know that they were maybe trying to portray him as not even necessarily being as like, they kept pointing out how like Adam Driver's character was supposed to be very like attractive, but not a great, didn't have a great reputation for, you know, he was obviously like very promiscuous. And that's how they portrayed his character. And then they were portraying Matt Damon's character as being maybe not very physically attractive, but he's the knight, like he's the fighter, like he is more brutish, he can't read, he's not maybe as intelligent, but he is a protector. Like that is, he has that like kind of more traditional in a sense like masculine qualities he's good at, but
Mm,
he's not,
yeah,
he doesn't
yeah, yeah,
have the looks
yeah.
or the features.
Right,
And
right, right, right.
so
Yeah.
I guess I'm just trying to, it was showing like even between Adam Driver's character and Matt Damon's character like two
Mm-hmm.
different versions of masculinity in a sense. And it's like maybe there's some positive aspects to both of them because in a sense like Adam Driver's character, he has the trait of being very intelligent, like he could speak in different languages, he could read Latin, he could translate Latin, like he had that like intelligence to him and that like suaveness and like the ability to, I guess, be to the prostitutes or whatever that he was with like sexually pleasurable to them, whereas Matt Damon's character was not as smooth, and was a little bit more like brutish and aggressive and all that, but he was the, and maybe he wasn't as good at being like very, I don't know, the, from Lady Marguerite's perspective it looked like he wasn't like the best in bed per se, like he was kind of just, you know, like trying to get the job
Yeah,
done rather than,
yeah, because he's a brute.
yeah,
There's no elegance to him. There's no tenderness to him. Yeah, he is.
yeah,
I can
exactly.
see. I can see I
See what
can
I'm
see
saying?
the attract. Well, not attraction, but I can see um the good qualities in him about a
Yeah.
masculine male, which is, he
Mhm.
protects. He's
Yeah.
he's maybe dependable. Um um but isn't, I don't know, I guess when I see him I see this archetype of you know I guess for me the two men represent like two different types of abusers, because you can be like, Legree, which is like a dandy, right? Like he's never faithful. He just like very scheming and narcissistic. That's one archetype.
Mhm.
That kind of man can abuse women.
Mhm.
But the Carouge, yeah, he's like loyal. He's not gonna like, fuck around.
Mhm.
But he's also just a brute, which means that he has a violent streak.
Well, and
And
he's kind of like,
he
yeah,
act
like
like,
he is
he
self-centered
he
too.
cannot contain his emotion. He did not deal with his emotions. So when he gets angry, he gets physical.
Yes. Yes.
And
And
and and
that is his
I
negative
I
aspect
but
of
yeah,
his
I know,
masculinity.
but I
Yeah.
guess for me, maybe because I'm a heterosexual man, right? So like I maybe his good qualities, that would, I guess, would be attractive to you and you can appreciate, does nothing for me. Like I all I see is that he is this like um like I said. he is this person that brings in the paychecks, and doesn't like will not have affairs, but when he gets drunk, when he gets frustrated, he just beats up his wife and kids. you do There are these kind of men in the world. There's a lot of them. I
Yeah.
cannot, I just cannot bring myself to like to like compliment or appreciate him on his good qualities, because his negatives just far outweighs any. I don't know. Like again, like maybe I'm saying this because I'm not, I'm a man seeing these two men. I can sort of I cannot really look at them as a as a woman who might see them in this kind of like as a potential partners. I cannot do that, right?
Yeah.
Like I
That's
it's
what
not
he
in
is.
me to do that. Maybe that's why I cannot. Yeah, I agree. Like sort of uh uh conceptually, I can agree. Yeah, like he has these, these good qualities that might make him a good protector or
Mhm.
husband.
Mhm.
But I don't know, like just the fact that he,
He's
trying to
so
imagine
brutish.
myself as his wife,
Yeah.
I just cannot believe I would be happy at all with him.
Yeah.
I just don't
I don't
feel like
know.
I would be respected, or I don't know. Like, yeah, I might have to worry about where my next meal is, or but I don't know. I really,
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
and we didn't even well, I just want to point this out, and then I know we probably got to wrap this conversation
Yeah.
up, but we didn't even talk about like kind of the only reason why Lady Marguerite ended up with Sir John was because her father had done something where he was like viewed as a traitor to the crown or something, and so
Mm-hmm.
like had her she was truly at the mercy obviously of all the men in her life. Like she she didn't get to decide who she got married to. She ended up with this guy because her father had done something that pissed off the crown. So, because remember, there was that like part of it where her father was like a traitor to the crown. And I think like she would have been too noble for Matt Damon's character if her father hadn't have
Oh
committed that
yeah. Mm-hmm.
treason or whatever it was. Maybe it wasn't treason, but like he wasn't
Yeah, I
viewed
forgot
as
what
a
it was,
traitor.
but yeah, yep, yep. Mm-hmm.
And so Matt Damon's character like got her only for that reason. So she ended up as his wife. But I kind of viewed it as she, despite that kind of you could view it as a misfortune because she would have ended up with a maybe potentially a better man or a higher born man or something. She still ended up building like a relatively good life. I mean, I take everything you're saying, Chi, about the fact that he was apparently like an abusive husband. So it probably wasn't that great of a life. But he had given her or provided for her like a pretty high quality life to some degree that I think she was like somewhat like she was accepting of that. Like she received that. She was like okay with it. She did want to have a child, like maybe for her own sake, but I mean, in their context of their time, like he was concerned with having an heir, and so she was okay with that. I think she was on board with doing that because she also wanted a child. So she was willing to try her best to do her wifely duties. Now, that's another crazy part of this movie that they obviously point out is that a lot of the guilt of her not being able to bear a child was placed on her, not on him. There was
Mm-hmm.
never any question of like, oh, well, maybe it's his issue. Like maybe he's not fertile or whatever.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
on the woman. It's like, are you not enjoying yourself? Are you not like doing
Yeah.
this, doing
I mean,
that?
that's
Like,
another horrible thing is that, yeah, it's all women's fault. Yeah, but
but
that's
but
another
they
thing. Yeah.
that's what they showed in this movie. I think in reality of the real world back in those times, if the man was having trouble bearing an heir, he probably felt a decent amount of discomfort at that too. Like, I don't know if they thought about it at all, like, oh, this could be me. But I think that they did sometimes. I think sometimes they thought like it could be the man's issue, that they that there was no,
Yeah,
and especially,
I don't know about that actually. I have no idea if that's true. Or I thought
I
maybe
feel
like
like I've
if it was, if the place was, if the men thought, oh, maybe it was my problem. It wasn't I don't think anybody was thinking that, oh, I might be infertile. It's because maybe I did something wrong to, like, to anger the gods or something. So this is my reckoning or my punishment.
oh,
That my
well, I
wife
don't
now
know.
becomes, now my wife becomes barren. Like,
Men
but
seem
I
to
think the
be kind of
infertility is
sensitive
all.
about stuff regarding like that. So I think that a lot of times men do worry like maybe I'm not like, I don't
Yeah, no,
know.
you might be right. You might be. It's just that back in the day, we just the people didn't know enough about reproduct, the biology to realize, oh, it's like it's on both parties equally. Like, I think back then it's like, well, whatever is wrong with the reproduction is all women's fault. Not to say that nobody has ever doubted that, but I honestly don't
Yeah.
know, because I have no
Yeah.
idea how people think about fertility
Right.
at the
Me
time.
either.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, final questions to you is A, like, I got the impression at the end that we do not know if the child was actually Legree's or De Carouge's child.
Mm.
Is that what you got from it, or do you know based
I
on the
think so.
true story?
No,
Okay.
I don't remember very well. So I think that means that it was pretty ambiguous. So
Yeah.
we didn't know for sure whether the who
Yeah.
who was the child's father.
It sounds like from the movie that, at least in the if they followed what the true story actually was, it seemed like the child was at least raised as if it was De Carouge's child.
Yeah, because people
Um,
believe that if it was rape, then you cannot get pregnant from being raped. So
yeah, I
I
was
think that was
curious
that.
about that though, because I was like,
Yeah.
I was curious about some of that stuff. Like, in the, it wasn't just that; it was like the other conversation. Like, we kind of just touched on it, but like the conversations about like the views of that time of like how people got pregnant, and like, that it had to do with the female, the woman like feeling, basically having an orgasm, like that's how you get pregnant. And I don't know how actually accurate that is, if that could be very accurate to like the views of that time at that place. But I was curious about that. I might look into that later, because I was curious, like, what did people actually believe about that
Yeah,
stuff?
I
And
think I did wonder about that too, but I didn't look into it.
yeah,
I thought the whole thing could have been just like a plot device, such that
yeah,
it didn't really, like, the Lady Magritte was safe from that point on, because that debate, that doubt was put to rest, because A, her husband won the duel, and B, she was conceived, right? So therefore, she must be innocent, because
yeah,
if she was raped,
yeah,
there was no way that she could, yeah. So, like, that was
yeah.
just sort of, we can put all the doubt to rest,
Hmm.
and so we don't, like, as an audience, we don't have to sort of keep worrying about, have this continuing worry about Lady Marguerite and her fate, her child's fate, because somebody might think, oh, is that child, is that child Legree's, or the Carouges. Um,
Yeah.
I thought it was that, at least that serves that purpose, and whether that reflects the belief at the time, I had no idea.
Yeah, I know. That was my same thought, is like,
Yeah.
I understand how it's being used in the story, but is that historically accurate.
accurate.
I imagine
Yeah,
it probably
technology.
was for some places, but maybe I feel like those views were probably pretty obscure and nuanced at times too. But it seemed like in this story, the society had like a consensus that that is the
Hmm.
case, and that
Yeah,
may very well be true. I don't know enough about that history to know, but
yeah, me
it
neither.
was interesting for sure, because obviously like we have different like scientific understanding of things now, but they didn't have access to that information back then, so they had to explain things somehow. And it's kind of interesting how they, if that is true, how
Yeah,
they did attach that to the woman's like pleasure. um
yeah.
so in some sense that is more progressive than a lot of the other things that were taking place in this movie, but in the
Oh,
other
yeah,
sense it wasn't at
yeah.
all, you know what I mean?
Right,
So
right, right. Yeah.
anyways, um my other question to you, Chi, is I was kind of confused, and maybe it was supposed to be like this, but right at the very end of the movie, if you remember, it shows Lady Marguerite sitting in the beautiful like field watching her like two-year old 3-year old son like playing in the flowers or whatever, and it shows that, and then it kind of shows her face. It like pans around and looks at Lady Marguerite and her expression, but her expression is very just like kind of plain. So, or I couldn't read what it was supposed, that final view of her, what that impression was supposed to be. And maybe that was the point of it, is you're not, it's left ambiguous to the audience of like how she felt in the aftermath of it all. Like she seemed to be, it was like a very beautiful scene of her watching her child, so it's like seemed like she was content in the sense that she was getting to watch her son grow up after all, because that was her big fear right before the duel, was that she wouldn't get to do that. So that was like gratifying to see, but there was something else in her expression where it wasn't like total like happiness or whatever. It was just like, which obviously it wouldn't necessarily be total happiness, but it just was very left unclear, I thought. So I don't know if you felt that way or if you got a more
I did.
distinct impression.
No, no, no. I did, but I thought I, I think I was thinking at the time maybe she was wondering whether the like whose father, who
I
is this child's
know.
father?
That I
You
think
know,
that's,
like
yeah. I think that's what I was
I think
thinking.
I think she I think this is there was a little doubt that she would love the child and treat her because he is her own, right? But I think
Yeah.
in a way she was I don't know if the I but I also don't believe that it makes no difference to her whether whether it was Legree or the Carouge that like fathered the kid. I do believe there's a difference to her, even though she would like love the child,
Yeah.
um, enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
but I just just with all that went down,
Mhm.
and I mean back then even she couldn't tell, like who was the father. So I think that was something that's something that she would never have a closure over. And I mean, nowadays, again, it's more progressive. So like maybe nowadays, like you just wouldn't care, right? It's my child, so I don't care who the father was. It makes no difference to me. But back
Mhm.
then, especially, because that could have been like the result of a rape, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, even now, a lot of women would choose to abort the baby because of that.
Oh, I was
But
so glad that they did not get into that. Like I thought for a second when they showed her as pregnant, I thought they were going to get into a whole thing about like her not wanting the baby because she thought it was like the product of a rape. I'm so glad that they just like didn't go there with this movie, because they were already doing enough, I think, with the story they were trying to tell. And I'm glad that they just showed her like embracing the child basically
oh,
when it was
okay,
born.
I
Personally,
okay,
that's what I felt.
Yeah, I'm also, well, that didn't even occur to me whether they should go there or not. And
I just think it would have gotten way too political too fast because whatever creative decisions that they made on that Lady Marguerite's like interpretation of that situation, I think would have been creative license taken by the writers to decide that for that person who was a real person that really existed. And I guess in the true story, she actually bore a child. I'm assuming that was truly part of the story, that she was pregnant and did give birth to a child. So that's just what happened, and they don't know
yeah,
what the woman herself like
No,
actually
yeah.
felt.
I agree that if like, if whether a woman have the right to abort the you know the fetus, if it was a result of a rape, to get into that would be too much, way too much.
Yeah, it's just like beside like the main plot of this
Yeah,
story
no, I agree with you. I think
was not about that.
the film has done enough to has made enough a point. There's no way to, and and back then it wasn't. It probably is not even a choice, really. So like, why bother going there, right?
Well, I'm not saying that she would have had a choice. I'm saying I'm glad they didn't really show her feelings on the matter before the baby was born. Like, I'm glad they didn't have a scene where she was like,
Should I have it? Should I not have it?
not even that, but like, showing her not being happy about the pregnancy or something because she didn't know whose child it was. But if they were accurate in their portrayal of those people's interpretation at that time, that a baby could not be the product of a rape, the Lady Marguerite herself may have believed that too and would have thought this
Yeah,
is
exactly.
actually.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
because De Carouge or whatever did have sex with her right after, or very soon after the rape happened, it really could have been either one of theirs,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah.
But
Hmm.
I think that's what I was wondering right at the end, scene was, I think I was like watching the camera dwelled on the the little kid, the toddler,
Hmm.
for a minute, and we were watching the kid, and I was like watching it thinking like maybe there's going to be some indication of like whose child it was.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
then there wasn't really anything, and then it pans around to her face, and I think that's still what I was thinking was like maybe she's going to make some sort of indication about something, and then she didn't really, and then I was left feeling like, well, what did
Yeah,
that
because
mean?
she
Yeah,
wouldn't have known, right? There's no way for her
yeah,
to know even like who
yeah.
was the father. I think I like the ambiguity at the end, because just given what she has been through, it's probably very hard to feel like, happy, wholeheartedly happy. Yeah.
Well, I think she obviously was like happy to be able to see her son grow up, but I do think that
But
maybe
it's going to be
that
a complicated
final.
emotion, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to be because there's this like this cloud of like, yeah, I mean, even if she believed that a rape wouldn't result in pregnancy, but still, like, it's just that there's going to be that incident's going to be like a cloud over, especially like whichever whoever was the father, the the impregnation, it just wasn't a happy incidents regardless. So I think that's going to be like a shadow. Not to, again, not to say she's not going to love the her son, but you know, I
Well, I
imagine
think
if I if I
she
if I if I were her, that would just be like, that would be like a little cloud over this whole thing. Is like, well, it's either a rape or another rape, right?
well, I mean, well, I don't know. I don't know if she would have she obviously like did not want to have she didn't want to have sex with her husband after the
Yeah,
rape. She was trying to avoid that, and
for,
he
of
kind
course.
of
Yeah,
made
just raped her.
her do it or demanded that they do it anyways. But again, based off of the times that they were in, even Lady Marguerite would not, I don't believe, based on my understanding, I don't think she would have looked at the intercourse that she had with her husband as rape. She only probably viewed the Legree incident as rape because I think that there was the understanding back in those times was that there was no understanding back in those times that like even your husband could rape you. Like I don't think that they had that type of language to
Okay,
describe
sure.
that.
Yeah, sure.
You
But I
know what
think
I
that's
mean?
but
Like
I think, yeah, I do. But I think that's technicality. Yeah, let's not call it rape. It's just what
yeah.
let's call it coerced sexual intercourse. It's not rape.
Well,
Back
my
then,
by today's standards we might call that rape, but I don't think she would have called it that. So she
no, no,
wouldn't
no,
have
no,
viewed it as that.
no,
She
no.
would have
She's not
viewed
gonna
it
call it
as
rape.
a legitimate
No,
pregnancy.
I don't think so. I think, what, yes, legitimate pregnant, because that was, the father could have been her husband, sure.
Yeah.
But
She I think she would have been
but for all, just from what happened, that was a coerced sexual intercourse. If it's not rape, it's not rape, because by the standard of the time, yes, it was not rape because it was her husband who was doing it, but it was
yeah.
coerced for sure. So I
Yeah.
think, however you want to call it, is technicality. And
Okay.
my
Well,
point
I
is
was just trying to say that
my point is, regardless of whichever intercourse or whichever act that she experienced that resulted the pregnancy and the son, it wasn't enjoyable. So my point is, it was always going to be like this little cloud that just like sort of, that's hanging there. Maybe that's why she was not, when we saw her face, she was not like just totally radiantly happy, because maybe she saw some like feature that resembles Legree in the sun, so she was like having doubts, or maybe she was like musing the fact that, well, how do I get this son? Like, what was the, you know, and it was either a rape or coerced sexual intercourse.
right, but
How would I be? How would I be totally happy with that? When I think about this whole thing.
well, I think it's very clear in the movie like I think one of the most beautiful lines in the whole movie was right before the duel happens and she's saying to her husband she's saying that a child needs its mother more than a mother needs to be right. And that's how she felt. Like she wanted to be there with her child.
Yeah,
And I'm
of
sorry
course,
to
yeah,
be emotional, but I just think that did she the way the movie paints the character is that she loved the son, and I know you said that like multiple times before of like she obviously still loves her son, but I do think that final scene, the the ambiguity, maybe that's the right word for it, is about, yeah, maybe showing that even though the beliefs in that time were that a child could not be the product of rape, maybe her character in that final shot was kind of like doubting that or wondering, like you said, like who the father is. I think I was looking at it not necessarily expect. I know I used the word happy earlier, but I didn't really mean it like that. What I meant is I wasn't really expecting her to be visibly like radiantly happy. I just was looking for something more than what I mean, this that final shot doesn't really give you that much. Like her
Hmm.
emotion is not very clear like what it is. So maybe it is just like her like wondering about it. And I'm sure that you're correct. She probably, I mean, obviously like that series of events must have left an impression on her, and that cloud, as you say, lingered probably over her for many, many years to come. Like the fact that that rape happened, how her husband responded afterwards, and that finally that is how she gets pregnant. Like she wanted to get pregnant all that time and nothing ever happened, and then she finally does after these very, very unfortunate set of circumstances. So I'm sure that that did linger over her and that she
Yeah.
felt a certain way
Oh,
about it, but I think that she
also,
was happy to be able to see her son grow up,
yeah,
and that I don't think that would have.
yeah, I think that's true. Also, it just occurred to me that because the common belief at the time is if the women didn't have pleasure, like there's no way she can bear a child.
Right.
But
Yeah.
she realized at the moment that's not true.
Yeah.
because because
Because that's how
both
she
time,
bore a
yeah,
child.
yeah, so yeah,
Yeah.
so I think she must have realized at one point that no, this child can actually be Legrese's, because the belief that no pleasure, no pregnancy was obviously false, because there she is, right?
Right.
So I think maybe
Right.
that was what's going on in her mind, is that, well,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
which I think is
But I
brilliant,
guess
actually.
I in it I yeah, I agree. I agree. And actually I was going to say something, but I'll just leave it at that cuz I think that was a good conclusion. I think like the final thing that this movie plays upon pretty strongly is like the idea of what's more important, like, or not what's more important, but it's like the idea of the truth, like telling the truth versus like being right and telling the truth versus being self-protective in a way, or like being like I think the mother-in-law has this line that I think is very postmodern in nature, but I think it's an important component of this movie and of this story. Is the mother-in-law says, there is no right, there's only the power of men, or whatever. It's a very postmodernist statement because it's saying what is right or what is true doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is power. And she says the power of men, indicating that this is a time when men had all the power. Um, and I think that that is one aspect of the story, but it does this very, very interesting thing, which again, with nuance, which is great, is that what ends up happening is Lady Marguerite does decide to tell the truth, and in the name of, kind of, she believes that she was wronged, like something wrong happened to her and that this person cannot get away with it. And so it's like kind of in the name of right and wrong that she says this thing and claims this truth. And it, her husband maybe does it for different reasons, like he's doing it to maybe in self-interest of resolving like past bitterness and resentment towards this particular man that he had. Like he might not have been necessarily doing it for that, but she kind of does it because she believes she is wronged, and she's believes it will be right for this man to be punished for his crime. Like she was wronged, and that's why she does it. So she does end up saying the truth, despite like the precedent that was set earlier by like the mother-in-law kind of being like there is no right and wrong, or right doesn't matter, it's only the power of men, blah blah blah. Lady Marguerite has a different view. Her view is that no, we need to like stand up for like kind of like what is right in this instance. I mean, that's not exactly how she goes about it, but you get my point. And then in the end, Lady Marguerite kind of regrets it because she has the statement about the child needs its mother more than the mother needs to be right, which is kind of a different take on the whole thing. It's like not so much about there is no right, it's the power of men. It's like there is a right, but there are more important things sometimes than being right, or than sometimes it is more important to protect those that you love or the vulnerable people that you are responsible for, such as your baby, rather than risking your life in order to get uh, justice for a crime that was done for you. Like, even that, there are sometimes more important things than even that. Like, even though that seems like that should be the most important thing to Lady Marguerite, it ends up, oh, actually, I have this baby boy that is more important to me now than that. And she
Yeah.
says like that
Hmm.
is why so many women before me didn't said nothing, because they, out of almost like wanting to protect themselves, but maybe also trying to protect like the vulnerable, like if they had children, like if the mother of children risks her life, then those children are going to be without their mother. So it's like, very complicated matter, like the truth in this story, and it's all about the truth, but it's also all about how, what are the other things that come into play
Hmm.
when the truth is told. And I think that that is a really cool thing to see, because it wasn't a purely postmodernist take where they were saying the truth doesn't matter at all, but it was also not a purely like it's always right to stand up for the truth and like you should always tell the truth. Like, she does tell the truth, but then that results in this very, very scary and dangerous situation that she could have easily lost everything from. And she got kind of lucky, I guess, in the end. But yeah, I don't know. It was just like I loved how they painted that nuance as well. That's almost like a more um meta, I guess, like interpretation of this story, but I think that that was there too, and they did that really well.
Yeah, I
In
agree.
addition,
I think that just like mm, how much a mother would sacrifice for her own children, right? Like my own justice that used to matter so much before. I can
hmm
just throw that away because
yeah,
when I think about how this might like jeopardize my child's future, yeah, I'll throw that away easily.
yeah,
um I
and
think
it
it just like sort of quietly celebrates the sacrifice that women can make and are willing to make sometimes for, yeah, to like for her own offspring.
well,
um
and it's not
just
just
being like
that,
being
but
really selfless.
yeah, but it's also, it helps put into perspective, like even if she didn't have that baby boy, imagine how many women back in those times maybe said something and then regretted it later, even if there
Yeah.
was no child in the picture, like just they're risking their lives to say anything. And if they do say
Yeah.
something in the moment out of, the emotion of what just occurred and needing that, feeling that emotion of needing justice or wanting that protection of getting justice, of that perpetrator of that crime, but then realizing only after they've said something that, oh my gosh, now my life is at stake if I'm proven wrong in this, which so many times they probably were proven wrong even when
Hmm.
they were right. So it's
Yeah,
like
just very
just a
unfortunate.
very,
It's a very
yeah,
tragic situation.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it really helped you. I feel like it really was effective at the end watching that duel of how kind of helpless she was standing there. Like she could do nothing
Yeah.
except pray that her
Mm-hmm.
husband survived. Like,
Yes.
and how scary that is and how much she probably did regret it in that moment. It's like it all came to this and she's probably like, what the heck was why did I have to say something? That's what I would think. I'd be like, why did I do this? Like, this is horrible. This is a nightmare. And she ended up being spared, but in the end it's kind of like, was it all worth it? Maybe, but I mean, in the name of truth, maybe. I do believe, I guess, that truth is very, very important, and it's important to say the truth, and to speak as truthfully as you can. But it's very interesting how she points out that sometimes there are maybe other things that pull on your heartstrings that are more important, worth protecting than getting your own justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it was very well done, well acted, well directed, well written. Everything about it was very good. So, and it made for a lot of really interesting discussion. So,
Yeah.
thanks
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
recommending, Chi.
Yeah. I think no problem. It's a good movie. Very thought provoking, if nothing else. It didn't do very
Yes.
well at the box office though, because I do think just because I think people are maybe like very tired of all the like the politics and um I think the message is probably not very palatable to a lot of people, I think.
I don't know. Like Matt Damon, before I even watched this movie, like months ago, I saw this clip of Matt Damon and I couldn't find it. I was going to try to pull it up for this, but I saw this clip of Matt Damon explaining why The Last Duel did not make money or like why it didn't do well. And it was really interesting and really well put. And so I wish I could have found it again for this. So I'm sorry. I'm going to be poorly translating what I remember from it. But it was basically like he was saying, movies that like this used to rely so heavily on the box office, on people going to the theaters to see these movies. And now the box office is pretty much dominated by like big franchises like Marvel, and nobody goes to see these more artistic films. I don't want to say more artistic, but you know what I mean, like more
Mm-hmm.
not franchise movies.
Yeah.
And he kind of, I think it was, I mean, this movie, when did it come out? Like kind of during the pandemic, 2021.
Yeah.
So it was slightly
Mm-hmm.
after the height of the pandemic, but I think people were still not fully going back to movie theaters. Like this was long before like Spider-Man or Top Gun came out. Maybe it might have been around when Spider-Man was, but it was, I think he kind of blamed it on the fact that not so much on the message of the story, but on the fact that people weren't going to the movie theaters like they used to before the pandemic. And as a result, this movie needed those box office dollars to make its money back because it was an expensive movie to produce. Which you
Mm-hmm.
could tell by the watching it
Oh
is like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
very
Mm-hmm. Totally,
there.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the
Very well
sets, the
made. Yeah.
locations, the horses, as I pointed out, the costume design, like all of that looked very like they put a lot into it. And it just, there was not the box office attendance. And I don't know if it was so much the messaging of it or if it was just the fact that now things have switched over to streaming a lot. And I think that's what Matt Damon was saying, is like now everything's on streaming. So movies like this tend to go straight to streaming because they're not the big franchises that can still do well at the box office. But the trade-off is that you're not making as much money off of streaming. And so you can't produce a movie like this just for streaming because they need more money than that. They need the box office money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like kind of this catch-22, but I don't know. The marketing around it, I do remember maybe did play up the political side of it, or like the feminist side of it, and maybe that didn't help it. Maybe they shouldn't have played that up so much and just promoted it as like a good story, because I think that's what it really was. It was like not like super overly political or feminist, like to such a huge degree or anything. Like they show all three characters' perspectives, as we just spent the last 2 hours talking about. But I think a lot of people would have liked it that maybe wrote it off based off of the marketing. But I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, but that begs the question: why though? You know, like why would people be turned off if it was marketed that way? Because I really don't see this movie as being like unfair to. It wasn't
Mm-mm.
like
Me
trying to
either.
say, okay, all men are this, or women are that. No,
Mm-mm.
it just points to the fact that maybe it was trying to use this really old, you know, the story that's set up in the old, like old times, to try to like sort of
Mm-hmm.
uh poke at like women's situation nowadays. um and I can you know, because of that, because you know it's happened that the both men are portrayed in a really negative light. Maybe some male artists maybe would just be turned off by that. Maybe they're like, they would think that, I mean, without seeing the movie or misunderstanding it, think that this movie is all about like male blaming or like male shaming or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
um Maybe that's why, which is unfortunate, because I do think, yeah, I think this movie highlights some of the harsh realities of the women, um you know, in the old days and new. um yeah.
Well, I think, and you and I kind of showed in this conversation, like you can come at this movie from different perspectives too. Like
Yeah.
one person's interpretation of it might be different from somebody else's. So it's not that you have to all share, everyone who sees this movie needs to draw the same exact conclusions from it. I mean, I think that there's a point to the story, but
Hmm.
like you and I had some maybe different levels of empathy with different characters, or different interpretations of different characters. So, and I don't think it's one that should have or would have been a turnoff to men at all, because I think in some sense, like
Hmm.
the setting, the um the action sequences, like those are all things that typically, I mean, maybe stereotypically, but men tend to go after that stuff in movies,
Hmm.
a lot, and women do too, but maybe men are slightly more on average attracted to action movies than women are. And this isn't a total action movie, but it isn't without those really good, well choreographed, like medieval sword fighting sequences and battle sequences. And I don't know, they paint every character with a lot of nuance. So I feel like a lot of people from different perspectives can appreciate that and interpret that how they want to, in a sense. And that's what the movie is asking you to do, is like watch this and see what you think for yourself. So,
Hmm. Yeah.
and try to empathize with the plight of people in these times, especially the women. And I think anyone, even most men, modern day men, like they will watch this just like you did, Chi, and think like, oh my gosh, like you really see how brutal like men were back then, or some of them were, and how brutal some men can be. And that should, especially when you see like the violence towards Lady Marguerite, a lot of men don't like seeing that, like they don't want to see a woman get hurt just as much as women don't want to see women get hurt. So, you know,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
I
That's
think
true.
that
Yeah.
a lot of men can like get a lot of find this story interesting, and I just think that there's a lot of fear, or maybe not fear, but discomfort these days around like wokeism in movies, and if a movie is going to be too woke and inserting too much of a political agenda. I have to say I do not place this movie in that category at all. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it was like
Yeah.
putting forth like some really strong political agenda. I don't think it was woke at all. Like, I
No, I
think it
don't think
was
so either.
realistic.
Yeah.
I think it was realistic and interesting and intriguing.
Yeah.
So
I agree. I agree. Good movie. I think most people, yeah, I think it deserves like more like viewership than it actually got.
I
Good
agree.
movie though. I really like this movie. I wrote an article about it, like on the blog thing.
Oh yeah.
I
Anything
did.
else that you said in your article that we didn't touch on?
No, that's pretty much it. Because it was just like my perspective. I just pretty much wrote most of what I just said. But for example, like I saw the movie only in one way, right? Like I just didn't give any room for the two men to be any better than they're portrayed to be in Lady Marguerite's perspective. But but like you had a slightly different perspective or interpretation of the where the truth is in the three from the three perspectives. So yeah, that was not there in my article. So that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, I do want to be clear. I do think that De Carouge was, or De Carouge, however you say it, was very, I believe, Lady Marguerite's perspective that he was abusive towards her. But it's like an also thing where I think he also did actually do certain actions that maybe Lady Marguerite didn't emphasize as much, because from her perspective they don't matter as much because of these other like bad things he did to her, which in her
Mm-hmm.
case that is valid. um but I think he maybe also did do take certain steps and make certain decisions and actions thinking that he was doing it for her and to do right by her, and maybe also for himself. But that's the thing with marriage, at
Yeah.
least from a Catholic perspective of marriage, which this society in this movie was. um, when you are married, you are joined together in one flesh. You literally are, the way that it's viewed is that you are now one flesh. You are one body in a sense. And so when when De Carouge is maybe doing some things that appear to be purely out of like his own self-interest, there might have been a little bit of also him thinking about their well-being as a whole too. And when he gets very angry after, he's like, how could Degree like do this to me, like right after she tells him that she was raped, and he gets mad because of like what Degree did to him. Well, it is kind of to him too. It was also to her, but it's to them both and their marriage that this crime was committed. I mean, it was, in our modern day view, we view it as being primarily against her because she's the one that had to suffer the pain of the rape, of the physical pain of the rape and the emotional pain. He is only experiencing the emotional pain of it, and so his pain is maybe not as visceral, but it's still there. And if they these characters in that time had that view of marriage, that they're binded together in one flesh, bound together in one flesh, like that is also a sin against De Carouge's flesh, if that makes sense. And maybe
Yeah, it
there's
does
like
make
a,
sense. Yeah, yeah.
you know what I mean?
I
And
yeah, I do know what you
but
mean, but I think that was a more sort of noble explanation for it. I have a more sort of cynical interpretation, which is I think
right.
the whole response of Karuchi is that, well, my property was damaged by this other man. That's why he was angry towards this property. You know, it's
Yeah.
yeah, of course I agree. Yes, you can see that. Well, my wife is my flesh, so like you. But again, I don't think that explains why he'll be violent towards her afterwards. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, and I think I was gonna that was gonna be the next thing I was gonna say is there's also this other thing on top of that though that is this property thing, and that there is a transaction that takes place when a man take in during this time takes a woman in marriage, and that the father like hands off the daughter to the future husband, and there's this exchange of the dowry and everything else. So it is like there is a property aspect to it during that time that makes it less empathetic for us today, because there was that view of like the man is more, it seems like during that time there was a view of the man being more like almost possessive over the woman, which today is very toxic to us. Like we are like, no, 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 that is not how marriage works. Like, no. And women in marriage today do have a lot more freedom, as you pointed out, Chi. Like a woman can divorce a husband today a lot easier than back in those days, and a woman can walk away a lot easier. It's still difficult in a lot of situations even
Of
today,
course.
but
Yeah.
it's definitely not viewed the same way today, as like marriage was viewed as a very different thing back then. And I think that's very
Hmm.
hard, and I certainly am not claiming to have a very deep understanding of it, but I think that's very hard for us in our modern day minds to fully understand how differently people back then saw these things. And we just view it today as in our terms of like, oh, she's property and he owns her as like almost a slave to him. But I think it was more nuanced than that, and this story tries to show that a little bit, but it's still hard for us to wrap our modern minds around how people back then viewed marriage and viewed the marital relationship and marital duties and everything else. Um, so it's an interesting thing that I definitely have been interested in, and tried to like understand to some degree, but it's hard because we just don't view the world that way anymore, and they had very different worldviews back then. um, but this movie did a good job of showing
Hmm.
just how people operated in that time, and how how high the stakes were, and how politically things were a lot different back then, of how you had to fight for justice. Like, but I guess this was the very last duel that was like sanctioned by the
It was not actually.
government. Oh,
It was
okay.
not. It was not. Yeah. The Last Duel in France was actually I think, because I look into this actually. It was
Okay.
I think almost 200 years after this incident.
I was
It was
gonna
the
say,
yeah.
because I was like, were there? They're still pretty far back. Like it was in the
No,
1300s.
no,
I was
no,
like,
no,
I feel
no.
like there was stuff after that.
Yeah, yeah. No, it was no it was the last I think trial by combat or something. It was not like a
Oh yeah,
duel. You know, if it was like a
yeah,
duel between two men, then well, yeah, it was not the last. But the idea that the this trial by combat that happened in this movie was not the last one in France. Was not.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we said a lot, or at least I
Yeah.
did.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Good chat.
Good chat.
You want to do the outro?
Yes. Thanks to everyone for listening today, especially if you made it this far. We had a nice, very long conversation. But we appreciate you listening. I hope you enjoyed it. We'd love to hear your thoughts or feedback. So please leave a comment and like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you next time. Signing off. He's Chi and I'm Leah.
See you guys next time.
Bye.